There is a kind of silence that falls over a room right after someone humiliates you in front of everyone you love. It is not quiet. It is loud. It rings in your ears louder than the laughter that caused it. And on the night of my husband's 40th birthday, in a hall full of 200 guests, I sat inside that silence and I made a promise to myself. A promise that would take 3 years to keep. My name is Mira, and this is the story of how the man who tried to destroy me in public ended up losing everything he built on lies. But let me take you back to where it all began. I was 36 years old on the night this happened, married to Arjun for 11 years, a mother of 2 beautiful children. And for 11 years, I had smiled through insults, swallowed my pride, and told myself that family peace was more important than my own dignity. That night, we were celebrating Arjun's birthday at the biggest hall our family had ever rented. His older brother, Rajiv, had organized everything. Rajiv was the head of the family business, a real estate company that his father had built from nothing and that Rajiv had expanded into something worth crores. He was powerful. He was respected in every room he walked into, and he never let anyone forget it. I want you to understand something about Rajiv before I go further. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He never shouted. He never threw things. His cruelty was quiet, polished, delivered with a smile so that anyone watching would think he was joking. That is the most dangerous kind of cruelty there is, because no one believes you when you say it hurts. That night, halfway through dinner, Rajiv stood up with a microphone in his hand. Everyone assumed he was going to say something warm about his younger brother. Instead, he turned the microphone toward me. "Everyone," he said, smiling that smile. "You all know my sister-in-law, Mira. Some of you may not know that when she married into this family, she came from nothing. No business background, no family name, nothing. And yet here she is, sitting at the head table of a 5-star hall, eating food that costs more than what her father used to earn in a month." The room went still. A few people laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. I sat frozen, my fork halfway to my mouth, my face burning. He continued, "I always say, we gave this family a gift when we let her in. A charity case that turned into a wife. Isn't that right, Arjun? My husband, the man I had loved for 11 years, the man whose children I had raised, whose parents I had nursed when they were sick, whose debts I had quietly helped pay off with money from my own savings." My husband laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Just enough to tell the entire room that he agreed. Just enough to tell me that when it mattered most, he would not defend me. I remember looking down at my hands. I remember the sound of 200 people either laughing politely or looking away in awkward silence. I remember my youngest daughter, only 7 years old, tugging at my sleeve and asking, "Mama, why is everyone laughing at you?" I did not cry that night. I want to be very clear about that, because so many people, when they hear this story, expect me to say I ran to the bathroom in tears. I did not. I sat at that table, and I finished my dinner, and I smiled when people looked at me, because I refused to give Rajiv the satisfaction of seeing me break in public. But inside, something did break. Something that had been holding together for 11 years finally gave way. And in its place, something new began to grow. Something colder. Something more patient. Something that Rajiv, in all his arrogance, never saw coming. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Arjun's steady breathing beside me, I made myself a quiet promise. I was not going to shout. I was not going to fight. I was not going to demand an apology that would never come with sincerity. Instead, I was going to become someone that this family could not humiliate, could not ignore, and could not control. I was going to build something so solid, so undeniable, that the next time Rajiv opened his mouth to insult me in public, the entire room would know exactly who the fraud really was. I did not know yet how long this would take. I did not know yet how deep the rot inside that family business truly went. I did not know that within 2 years, I would uncover a secret that would not just humiliate Rajiv the way he humiliated me. It would end his career, expose him to the entire family, and force my own husband to finally choose a side. But that night, all I knew was this. I was done being quiet in the way that meant disappearing. I was going to be quiet in the way that meant planning. If you have ever sat in a room and been humiliated by someone who was supposed to love you, supposed to respect you, supposed to protect you, you already know the feeling I am describing. That specific mix of shame and fury that sits in your chest like a stone. Stay with me, Because what happened next is going to show you exactly what a person can build out of that stone, if they are patient enough. I remember the drive home that night with a clarity that still surprises me, years later. Arjun sat behind the wheel, humming along to the radio as if nothing unusual had happened, as if his brother had not just stripped away my dignity in front of everyone we knew. Our 2 children slept in the back seat, tired from the late hour, unaware that their mother's entire world had quietly rearranged itself in the space of a single toast. I looked out the window at the streetlights blurring past and asked myself a question I had never dared to ask so directly before. What exactly was I still fighting for? Was it really family peace, the way I had always told myself? Or had I simply grown so used to shrinking myself that I no longer remembered what it felt like to take up space without apologizing for it? When we got home, I helped carry the children up to bed, tucked them in, kissed their foreheads, and stood for a long moment in the doorway of their room, watching them sleep. My daughter's small hand was curled around her stuffed elephant, the same toy she carried everywhere. I thought about the question she had asked me at dinner. Why is everyone laughing at you, Mama? I did not have a good answer for her that night, but I promised myself, standing in that doorway, that I would have one eventually. Not an explanation, an outcome. A story I could tell her one day about what her mother did after being humiliated, instead of simply what was done to her. Downstairs, after the children were asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour, replaying the moment again and again in my mind. I did not think about revenge yet, not in any concrete way. I simply thought about the specific texture of that humiliation, how public it was, how casual, how effortless it seemed for Rajiv to reach into a room full of people and pull out exactly the words that would hurt me most, all while making it look like nothing more than harmless teasing. There is something particularly cruel about humiliation delivered as comedy. It strips you of the ability to respond with dignity. If you get angry, you are accused of being unable to take a joke. If you laugh along, you confirm, in everyone's eyes, that the insult was true enough to be funny. There is no dignified exit from that trap, except one: to walk away from the entire game so completely that the person humiliating you no longer has any power left to use against you. That was the seed of everything that followed. Not a plan yet. Just a single, quiet decision, made in an empty kitchen at midnight, that I would no longer play a game designed for me to lose. I want you to remember that kitchen, that midnight hour, that specific version of me sitting alone with nothing but a cup of cooling tea and a wounded pride, because everything that follows in this story grew from that single quiet moment. There was no dramatic music playing, no sudden burst of confidence, no immediate clarity about what I would do next. There was only a woman deciding, in the smallest and most private way possible, that she was worth more than the role she had been playing for 11 years, and that decision, small as it seemed at the time, turned out to be the most powerful thing I ever did. Let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you who I was before that night, and how a girl who grew up with almost nothing ended up sitting at that table, silently rewriting her entire future in her head, while everyone around her thought she was simply eating her dinner in embarrassed silence. To understand why Rajiv's words cut so deep, you need to understand where I came from. I grew up in a small 2-room house on the outskirts of the city. My father worked as a clerk in a government office. My mother stitched clothes for neighbors to bring in extra money. We did not have much, but we had enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough love. My parents taught me that dignity was not about how much money you had. It was about how you treated people and how you carried yourself when no one was watching. I studied hard. I got a scholarship to a decent college. I worked part-time jobs to help my family while I studied commerce, dreaming of one day having a stable career, maybe even starting a small business of my own someday. I was ambitious in a quiet way, not the kind of ambition that shouts, the kind that works silently in the background, saving a little every month, learning a little every day. I met Arjun at a mutual friend's wedding. He was kind then, genuinely kind. He would talk to me for hours about his dreams, about wanting to build something meaningful with his life, something separate from his family's business empire. I fell in love with that version of him, the version who seemed to see me as an equal, not as a favor he was doing me. When we decided to get married, his family was polite on the surface but cold underneath. His mother asked pointed questions about my family's financial background during our very first meeting. His father barely looked at me. But Rajiv, Rajiv was the one who made his feelings the clearest, even back then. At our engagement ceremony, he pulled Arjun aside, and though I was not meant to hear it, I did. "Are you sure about this?" Rajiv had said. "She has nothing to bring to this family. No connections, no capital, nothing. You could have married into money. Instead, you're marrying a girl whose father counts coins for a living." Arjun had defended me that day. He told his brother that love was not about money, that I was smart and hardworking and would make an excellent partner. I clung to that memory for years because it reminded me of the man I thought I had married. But marriages change people, or perhaps they simply reveal who people already were underneath. Over the years, as Arjun became more involved in the family business, as he began depending on his older brother for his position, his salary, his status within the family, his spine began to soften. Slowly, so slowly that I almost did not notice it happening. He stopped standing up for me. He stopped correcting his mother when she made snide comments about my cooking, my clothes, my background. He stopped defending me when Rajiv made his little jokes at family gatherings. I told myself it was because he did not want to create conflict. I told myself he still loved me, that he simply did not know how to stand up to his older brother, who had practically raised him after their father's health declined. I made excuse after excuse, because the alternative, accepting that the man I loved was choosing comfort over my dignity, was too painful to face directly. For the first few years of our marriage, I threw myself into being the perfect daughter-in-law. I woke up early to prepare breakfast for the entire household. I learned to cook the specific dishes Rajiv's wife, Priya, was known for, hoping it would earn me some acceptance. I took care of Arjun's parents when they fell ill, spending nights in hospital corridors while Priya, the proper daughter-in-law with the right family background, made brief visits and left early, claiming exhaustion. And still, none of it was ever enough. Because in that family, respect was not earned through hard work or sacrifice. It was measured by what you brought to the table before you even arrived. And I had brought nothing but myself. To them, that was worthless. Rajiv's insults started small. A comment here, a joke there, always disguised as humor, always delivered with a smile that made it impossible for me to react without looking oversensitive. "Mira, be careful with that necklace. It probably cost more than your father's yearly salary." Small daggers, dropped casually into conversation, designed to remind me of my place. I want to pause here and say something important. If you are listening to this and you recognize this pattern in your own life, someone who insults you but frames it as a joke, someone who humiliates you but expects you to laugh along, please know that this is not something you are imagining. This is a form of control, and the people who do this count on your silence to keep doing it, again and again, for years. I stayed silent for 11 years, not because I was weak, but because I believed, foolishly, that silence would eventually earn me peace. It did not. It only taught Rajiv that he could go further each time, because I would never push back. What I did not know, during those quiet years of swallowing insult after insult, was that Rajiv was not just cruel to me in words. He was also, behind the scenes, doing something far more dangerous to the family business, something that would eventually connect directly to my husband, to our finances, and to the very future of our children. The humiliation at that birthday party was not the beginning of my story. It was simply the moment I stopped accepting the ending Rajiv had already written for me. I remember one incident in particular from our third year of marriage that I think captures the pattern perfectly. Arjun's mother had fallen seriously ill, requiring nearly 3 weeks of hospital care. During that entire period, I was the one who stayed by her bedside every single night, sleeping in an uncomfortable plastic chair, managing her medications, coordinating with doctors, while Priya visited for perhaps 20 minutes each afternoon before returning home, always with some reason why she could not stay longer: the children, a headache, an appointment. When Arjun's mother recovered, I expected, foolishly, that this might change something in how the family saw me. Instead, at a small gathering to celebrate her recovery, it was Priya who received praise for her devotion as a daughter-in-law, because she had thoughtfully arranged the flowers in her mother-in-law's hospital room during one of her brief visits. Nobody mentioned the 3 weeks I had spent barely sleeping. Nobody mentioned the nights I had held my mother-in-law's hand while she cried from the pain of her treatment. It was as if my contribution existed in a category invisible to the rest of the family, simply because it did not come wrapped in the right kind of performance, the right kind of visible, photographed devotion. I did not say anything that night either. I smiled, I nodded, I complimented Priya's flower arrangement along with everyone else. But I remember walking to the bathroom afterward and staring at myself in the mirror for a long time, trying to understand what exactly I needed to do differently. The honest answer, which took me years to accept, was that there was nothing I could have done differently. The problem was never my effort. The problem was that this family had already decided, long before I ever arrived, exactly how much value they were willing to assign to someone like me, and no amount of quiet sacrifice was ever going to change that internal calculation. I remember another moment from those early years that I have never told anyone outside my own family, not even Divya. In our second year of marriage, I had saved enough from small tuition classes I gave to neighborhood children to buy Arjun a watch for our anniversary. Nothing extravagant, but something I had chosen carefully, saved for over 4 months, and wrapped with more care than I had ever wrapped a gift in my life. At the family dinner that evening, Rajiv picked up the box before Arjun even had a chance to open it, examined the brand name, and said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "Careful, Arjun, don't let it break. I don't think she can afford to replace it." Everyone laughed. Arjun laughed too, softly, before opening the box and thanking me with a kiss that suddenly felt more like an apology than a gesture of love. I wore a smile through that entire dinner. I have worn many smiles through many dinners over the years, each one a small act of survival rather than genuine happiness. It took me a long time to understand that the smiling itself, the constant performance of being unbothered, was slowly costing me something important. My ability to trust my own reactions, to know clearly when something was actually wrong, instead of constantly second-guessing whether I was simply being too sensitive. There were quieter cruelties too, ones that never happened in front of witnesses and therefore never had to be denied. Comments from my mother-in-law about how my cooking, though adequate, lacked the refinement of a proper household. Suggestions from Priya about which saris were more appropriate for certain occasions, delivered with a smile that made the underlying judgment impossible to challenge directly. Small, constant reminders, spoken and unspoken, that I was tolerated rather than truly welcomed, accommodated rather than valued. I want to be fair in telling this story, because not everyone in that family treated me this way. Arjun's father, before his health declined significantly, was often kind to me in his own quiet manner, occasionally complimenting my handling of household finances or asking my opinion on small business matters in a way that suggested he, at least, did not share his older son's dismissiveness. I held on to those small moments of respect carefully, rationing them like scarce resources during years when they were rare enough to matter deeply. This is something I think is worth pausing on, because I know many people listening to this story will recognize it in their own families, their own workplaces, their own relationships. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from working hard, but from working hard in a system that has already decided your effort does not count the same way as someone else's. You can pour everything you have into proving your worth, and if the people around you have already made up their minds about your place in the hierarchy, that effort simply disappears into the air, unrecognized, unrewarded, sometimes even resented. I want to be clear that I do not tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this because it explains something crucial about why Rajiv's humiliation at that birthday party hit as hard as it did. It was not one insult. It was the final entry in a ledger that had been quietly accumulating for 11 years, entry after entry of being overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued, until that public moment finally forced everything to the surface at once. In the next part of this story, I will tell you about the specific incidents that followed that birthday party, moments that pushed me from quiet endurance into quiet investigation. Because what I discovered next was far worse than insults. It was betrayal on a scale I never imagined possible, hidden inside the very company that fed our entire family. Stay with me. Because the woman who sat silently at that dinner table, absorbing shame in front of 200 people, was about to become someone Rajiv never expected. Someone who watches, who listens, who learns, and who waits for exactly the right moment to strike. 2 weeks after the birthday party, life went back to what looked like normal. Nobody in the family mentioned what Rajiv had said. Nobody apologized. It was as if 200 people had watched me be humiliated and then collectively agreed to pretend it never happened. That silence, I would later realize, was almost worse than the insult itself. Arjun tried, in his own limited way, to smooth things over. One night, he told me, "You know how my brother is. He doesn't mean it seriously. That's just his sense of humor." I remember looking at him and asking a simple question. "Would you find it funny if someone said that about your mother in front of 200 people? He had no answer. He just looked away and changed the subject, the way he always did when a conversation became too uncomfortable for him to handle. That was the moment I understood something clearly. I was not going to get an apology. I was not going to get protection. If I wanted my dignity back, I was going to have to build it myself, brick by brick, without anyone's help. So I started small. I began waking up an hour earlier than usual, using that quiet time before the household stirred to read about business, finance, and small enterprise. I had always been good with numbers back in college, a skill that had gone unused for over a decade while I focused entirely on the household. I started relearning it, quietly, without telling anyone. At the same time, something strange started happening at the family office. I want to explain how I even had access to notice these things. Twice a week, I helped manage the household accounts, which included some overlap with minor business expenses, since our home was technically registered as a guest facility for the company's visiting clients. This gave me a small window into invoices, payments, and paperwork that passed through our house. At first, I did not think anything of it. But over a few months, I began noticing certain invoices that did not add up. Payments to vendors I had never heard of. Amounts that seemed inflated compared to what similar services normally cost. A recurring monthly transfer to something called Highline Consulting Services, a name that meant nothing to me, and, when I quietly searched for it online one evening, seemed to belong to a company with almost no real presence, no clear address, no verifiable clients, nothing beyond a bare-bones website. I did not say anything yet. I want to be honest with you about this part of the story, because it is important. I was not some fearless detective the moment I noticed these irregularities. I was scared. I was scared that if I asked the wrong question, Rajiv would find a way to make my life even harder, to turn Arjun further against me, to isolate me completely from a family I had spent 11 years trying to belong to. So instead of confronting anyone, I did something quieter. I started keeping a private notebook. Every time I saw an unusual invoice or transaction, I wrote down the date, the amount, and the vendor name. I told myself I was simply being careful, protecting myself in case anyone ever accused me of mismanaging the household accounts I had access to. But somewhere deep down, I think I already knew I was building something much bigger than a defense. I was building a case. Around this time, the humiliations continued, though in smaller doses. At a family lunch, Rajiv made a comment about how some people in the family had married up rather than being born into wealth, glancing at me while everyone chuckled politely. At my daughter's school function, Priya made a remark in front of other mothers about how impressive it was that I had adjusted so well to a lifestyle that was clearly not something I grew up with. Each comment was small. Each one was deniable. Each one added another layer of quiet fury beneath my calm exterior. But something had shifted in me since that birthday party, where before I would go home and cry quietly in the bathroom so no one would hear. Now I went home and opened my notebook. I studied the patterns. I researched. I learned about corporate structures, about how family businesses can be manipulated by insiders, about how easy it can be for someone in a position of trust to slowly drain a company if no one is paying close attention. I also started rebuilding a piece of myself that had been buried for 11 years, my own ambition. I remembered an old college friend, Divya, who had built a small but successful interior design consultancy. I reached out to her, cautiously at first, just to reconnect. She remembered how sharp I used to be with numbers and budgets back in college, and she offered me freelance bookkeeping work for her small clients, work I could do from home in the hours my children were at school. I did not tell my in-laws. I did not tell Arjun, not fully. I simply said I was helping an old friend occasionally. In reality, I was quietly rebuilding a professional identity that had nothing to do with the family that had spent over a decade telling me I brought nothing of value to their table. Every rupee I earned from that freelance work, I saved separately. Every skill I sharpened with a specific goal in mind, though I could not yet fully articulate what that goal was. I only knew that I no longer wanted to be a woman who depended entirely on a family that saw her as a charity case. I wanted to become someone whose worth could not be questioned, whose success could not be dismissed with a smile and a microphone. There was one particular afternoon during this period that I still think about often. Divya had asked me to help one of her clients, a small boutique owner named Farida, untangle nearly a year of chaotic bookkeeping before tax season. I spent an entire weekend at my dining table, surrounded by receipts and spreadsheets, completely absorbed in the work in a way I had not felt in years. When Farida called to tell me that my work had saved her nearly 60,000 rupees in unnecessary penalties, and that she had never had anyone explain her own finances to her so clearly before, I sat at that table afterward and cried. Not from sadness, from something closer to recognition. The simple, overwhelming relief of being told, clearly and specifically, that I was good at something, that my mind had value, after more than a decade of being told the opposite in 100 quiet ways. I did not share that moment with anyone in Arjun's family. It felt, in a strange way, too precious to risk exposing to people who I knew would find some way to diminish it, the same way they diminished everything else I did. I kept it for myself, a small private proof that Rajiv's version of me was not the only version that existed. Meanwhile, the discomfort at family gatherings continued to simmer beneath the surface of polite conversation. I noticed that Rajiv had started being unusually generous toward Arjun during this period, praising him more publicly than he ever had before, giving him small promotions and responsibility within the company, inviting him to sit in on higher-level meetings he had previously excluded him from. At the time, I remember feeling a flicker of hope that perhaps something had shifted, that perhaps the brothers' relationship was genuinely improving. I also began, during this period, paying closer attention to how Rajiv spoke about money in general, not just within the specific vendor payments I had flagged. I noticed he had started making small, almost boastful comments about a plot of land he was planning to purchase and a family trip to Europe he was considering. Expenses that seemed slightly out of proportion to what I understood of his declared salary and the company's overall performance that year. None of this was proof of anything on its own. Plenty of successful businessmen make large purchases without any wrongdoing involved. But combined with the vendor irregularities I had already been tracking, it added another thread to a pattern that was slowly becoming impossible for me to ignore. I started organizing my notebook more carefully around this time, no longer simply jotting down dates and amounts in a haphazard way, but creating actual categories, vendor names, payment dates, corresponding amounts, and a separate column where I noted any related comments or behavior I observed from Rajiv around the same time period. I did not have any formal training in fraud investigation. I simply applied the same careful, methodical attention I had once used to balance our household budget on a modest income, back before I married into a family that never had to think twice about money. Looking back now, with everything I eventually learned, I understand that this sudden generosity was not warmth. It was strategy. Rajiv was not elevating Arjun out of brotherly affection. He was quietly, deliberately, positioning him closer to the exact financial responsibilities that would make him an easy target if anyone ever noticed the irregularities Rajiv had been building for years. He was not preparing his brother for success. He was preparing him to take a fall. I did not see this clearly at the time, of course. Hindsight has a way of making patterns obvious that were nearly invisible while they were unfolding. All I knew, in those months, was that something about the sudden warmth felt slightly performative, slightly too convenient, and my instinct told me to keep watching closely, to keep writing in my notebook, even when there was nothing dramatic yet to record. Then, 6 months after the birthday party, something happened that turned my quiet suspicions into something far more serious. Something that would not just confirm what I feared about Rajiv, it would put my own husband directly in danger. It started with a phone call late one evening. Arjun came home from the office looking pale, his hands slightly shaking as he set down his bag. I asked him what was wrong, and for the first time in years, he actually told me the truth instead of brushing me off. The company's external auditors had flagged a serious discrepancy in the accounts. A significant amount of money, nearly 40 lakh rupees, had gone missing over the past year, funneled out through vendor payments that did not correspond to any real services rendered. And because Arjun was the one who technically signed off on several of those vendor approvals, a routine task Rajiv had been quietly shifting onto him over the past year, always framed as giving you more responsibility. The auditor's initial findings pointed a finger directly at my husband. I sat there listening to Arjun explain this, and my mind went immediately to my notebook, to Highline Consulting Services, to the pattern of unusual payments I had been tracking for months. I did not say anything to him that night about what I had discovered. I needed to think clearly first, without emotion clouding my judgment. Over the following days, the situation grew worse. Rajiv called a private family meeting, and in front of his parents and Priya, he expressed deep concern and disappointment about Arjun's carelessness with the company finances. He spoke gently, almost sympathetically, but the message was unmistakable. He was positioning himself as the responsible elder brother who had trusted his younger sibling with too much authority, and Arjun as the reckless one who had let outsiders exploit that trust. I watched Rajiv's performance that evening with a clarity I had never had before. This was not concern. This was strategy. He was building a narrative, carefully, in front of witnesses, that would protect himself if the missing money was ever fully traced. And the person he was preparing to sacrifice for that protection was my husband. The same husband who had laughed along when Rajiv humiliated me in front of 200 people. That night, after everyone had gone home, I finally showed Arjun my notebook. Months of documented irregularities. Highline Consulting Services and 2 other similarly vague vendor names, all receiving payments that spiked suspiciously around the same periods the auditors had flagged. Arjun stared at the pages for a long time in silence. "Where did you get all this?" he finally asked. "I've been paying attention," I said quietly. "Someone in this family has to." For the first time in years, I saw something shift in my husband's face. Not just fear about the accusations against him, but a dawning realization about who had actually been protecting this family's interests all along, quietly, without recognition, while his brother built an image of himself as the responsible one and dismissed me as someone who brought nothing of value. We did not go to Rajiv immediately. I want to explain why, because it is an important part of this story. If we had confronted him directly at that stage, with nothing but a notebook full of my personal observations, Rajiv had the resources, the credibility, and the family's trust to dismiss it entirely. He could have twisted the situation to make it look like I was fabricating accusations to protect my husband, or worse, that Arjun and I together had manipulated those accounts ourselves. Rajiv was not a man who left himself exposed. If we were going to expose him, we needed something undeniable. Something no amount of charm or family loyalty could talk away. In the days between the auditor's initial findings and that late-night conversation over my notebook, I watched my husband endure a version of the humiliation I had lived with for over a decade, except concentrated into a matter of days instead of stretched across years. Rajiv's parents began speaking to Arjun in careful, worried tones, the kind reserved for someone whose judgment can no longer be fully trusted. Colleagues at the office, sensing which way the internal politics were shifting, grew subtly cooler toward him, less willing to be seen agreeing with him in meetings, unsure yet which brother would emerge from this situation still holding power. Arjun came home one evening and told me about a meeting earlier that day where Rajiv had gently suggested, in front of 2 senior managers, that perhaps Arjun should step back from financial approvals for a while, just until this gets sorted out, for his own protection. On the surface, it sounded almost kind. Underneath, both of us understood exactly what it meant. Rajiv was quietly removing his brother from any position of authority, publicly, gradually, in a way that made it look like protection rather than what it actually was, the deliberate isolation of the person he intended to blame. I remember Arjun sitting at our kitchen table that night, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. This was a man who had grown up believing, completely and without question, that his older brother would always protect him, the same way he had grown up watching his brother handle every family crisis with effortless confidence. Watching that belief crack in real time was, in its own way, almost as painful to witness as my own humiliation had been to experience. "I keep thinking about all the times I defended him," Arjun said quietly that night. "Every time someone in the family criticized how he ran things, I told them they didn't understand him, that he always had a plan, that he always knew what he was doing. I actually believe that. I think some part of me still wants to believe it, even now, even with what you've shown me." I did not judge him for that moment of hesitation. Loyalty built over an entire childhood does not dissolve instantly, even in the face of clear evidence. I simply sat beside him, and I told him the truth as gently as I could. Believing in someone and being loyal to the truth are not always the same thing, I said. You can love your brother and still refuse to be sacrificed to protect him. Over the following days, I also began paying closer attention to something I had previously dismissed as unrelated: the growing tension between Rajiv and his own wife. Priya, I noticed, had started speaking to her cousin, the one whose name appeared repeatedly in my notebook, far more frequently than usual. Phone calls that used to be occasional had become almost daily. I did not yet understand the significance of this pattern, but I made a note of it anyway. The same instinct that had led me to start the notebook in the first place, telling me that unusual behavior, even from unexpected people, was worth remembering. I also want to describe the specific fear that settled over our household during this period, because I think it is important for anyone listening to understand that this story was not simply a triumphant march toward justice. There were nights I lay awake terrified that we were wrong, that perhaps the irregularities I had documented had some innocent explanation I had failed to consider, that we were about to destroy a family relationship over a misunderstanding. There were nights Arjun paced our bedroom floor, torn between loyalty to a brother who had shaped much of his identity and a growing, undeniable suspicion that something was deeply wrong. We did not rush. Even after that late-night conversation over my notebook, we spent nearly 3 more weeks simply observing, gathering small additional details, before deciding to bring in outside help. I remember telling Arjun, during one particularly anxious night, "If we are wrong, we will apologize completely and never speak of this again. But if we are right, and we say nothing, we will spend the rest of our lives regretting our silence." That thought, more than anything else, was what finally pushed us to act. That night marked a turning point in our marriage as much as it did in this larger story. Arjun, for the first time in over a decade, looked at me not as someone he had to manage or smooth over, but as someone whose intelligence and instincts he genuinely needed. He apologized, quietly, for the birthday party, for years of silence, for choosing comfort over standing beside me. I did not fully forgive him that night. Trust like that does not return in a single conversation. But it was a beginning. We made a decision together. We were not going to panic. We were not going to confront Rajiv emotionally and lose whatever advantage we had. Instead, we were going to build a case so complete, so well documented, that when the moment came to expose it, there would be no room for him to talk his way out. I remember lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the woman who had sat silently at that birthday dinner just months earlier, absorbing humiliation because she believed she had no power to respond. That woman felt very far away now. In her place was someone sharper, calmer, more dangerous in the quiet, patient way that only comes from years of being underestimated. Rajiv had spent over a decade treating me as invisible, as insignificant, as someone whose opinions and abilities did not matter. That invisibility, I realized, was about to become the greatest weapon I had ever held. Because no one prepares for an attack from someone they never believed was capable of fighting back. In the next part of this story, I will tell you exactly how we built our case, the allies we quietly gathered, the risks we took, and the moment I finally decided that quiet suffering was over and quiet strategy was about to become something far more powerful. Because what Rajiv did not know, as he sat comfortably at the head of that family business, confident that no one would ever question him, was that the woman he called a charity case was about to become the reason his entire empire came crashing down. There is a specific moment in every story like this one where a person crosses a line they can never uncross. For me, that moment came not from anger, but from fear. The fear of watching my husband's name be destroyed for a crime he never committed, while the actual person responsible sat comfortably in his office, untouched. The week after the auditor's findings became known throughout the extended family, whispers began. Distant relatives who barely spoke to us started calling, asking careful questions in the tone people use when they already believe the worst but want to appear neutral. Arjun's own mother, a woman who had never fully accepted me but had always respected her younger son, began looking at him with a kind of quiet disappointment that broke my heart to witness. I understood, in that moment, that if we did not act, this narrative would harden into truth simply through repetition. People do not always believe what actually happened. They believe what is said the most often, by the most confident voice in the room. And Rajiv's voice was always the most confident in every room he entered. So I made a decision. I was done waiting to be handed permission to defend my family. I was going to build the proof myself. The first person I brought into this was Divya, my old college friend who had been giving me freelance bookkeeping work. Divya's husband, it turned out, worked in a mid-level position at a private forensic accounting firm, the kind of firm that specializes in tracing exactly where money goes when someone tries to hide it inside legitimate-looking paperwork. I remember sitting across from him at a small coffee shop, sliding my notebook across the table, my hands trembling slightly as I asked him a question I had never imagined myself asking anyone. "Can you tell me if this is fraud? And if so, can you prove it?" He looked through my notes for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he looked up at me and said something I will never forget. "Whoever built this pattern was careful. But careful is not the same as invisible. Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were some of the longest of my life. I continued my daily routine exactly as before, cooking, managing the household, smiling politely at family gatherings, absorbing the occasional comment from Priya about how stressed I looked lately, as if stress were a personal failing rather than the result of watching your family be quietly destroyed from the inside. I said nothing. I gave nothing away. I had learned, over 11 years of practice, how to keep my face calm while my mind worked furiously underneath. During this time, I also began strengthening the other part of my plan, the part that had nothing to do with proving Rajiv's guilt and everything to do with proving my own worth. My freelance bookkeeping work with Divya's clients had grown steadily over the months. I was good at it, better than good, actually. I had a natural instinct for spotting inefficiencies, for organizing chaotic finances into clear, manageable systems. Divya, impressed by my work, introduced me to 2 more small business owners who needed help untangling their accounts. Within a few months, without anyone in my husband's family knowing, I was quietly running a small, but genuinely profitable bookkeeping and financial consulting service from my dining table, working while my children were at school, saving nearly every rupee I earned into a separate account that I did not touch. I want to pause here and tell you something important about why this mattered so much to me, beyond simply the money. For 11 years, I had been told, in ways both loud and subtle, that I brought nothing of value to this family, that I was fortunate simply to be included. Every client I helped, every account I balanced, every small business I helped save from financial chaos was proof to myself, more than to anyone else, that I had never been the charity case Rajiv described. I had simply never been given the chance or the respect to show what I could do. 2 weeks after that coffee shop meeting, Divya's husband called me. What he had found exceeded even my worst suspicions. Highline Consulting Services and the 2 other vendor names I had flagged were not real businesses at all. They were shell companies, registered under names that led back, through a careful trail of paperwork, to a cousin of Rajiv's wife, Priya, someone who had no actual role in providing any consulting services to the company whatsoever. Over 18 months, nearly 90 lakh rupees had been funneled out of the family business through these fake vendor payments, disguised carefully enough to survive a casual glance, but not careful enough to survive a proper forensic trace. Rajiv had not just been humiliating me for years. He had been quietly stealing from the very business his own father had built, from the very family he claimed to protect and lead, all while positioning my husband to take the blame if anyone ever noticed. I remember the exact moment I showed this evidence to Arjun. We sat together at our kitchen table late at night, the children asleep upstairs, the forensic report spread out between us like a map of every lie Rajiv had ever told. Arjun did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, almost broken. "My own brother," he said. "He was willing to let me take the fall for this. For years, I defended him. I laughed along when he humiliated you, because I told myself he was still my brother, that family loyalty mattered more than anything else. And this whole time, he was stealing from us, and he was ready to sacrifice me to protect himself. I did not say, 'I told you so.' I did not need to. The truth had spoken loudly enough on its own. That night, we made a decision together that would shape everything that followed. We were not going to expose Rajiv quietly, in a private meeting where he could manipulate the story, deny everything, and perhaps even convince his parents that Arjun and I had fabricated evidence out of jealousy. We were going to expose him publicly, undeniably, in front of the same family that had watched him humiliate me at that birthday dinner. Because if he was going to build his cruelty on a stage in front of everyone, then his downfall deserved a stage too. But before we could plan that moment, we needed one more thing, a way to make sure that when the truth came out, it would come with consequences that Rajiv could not escape. It was time to plan not just an exposure, but a complete and undeniable dismantling of everything he had built on lies. Revenge, done carelessly, can destroy the person seeking it just as much as the person it targets. I knew this instinctively, even before I fully understood what I was planning. I did not want to simply humiliate Rajiv the way he had humiliated me. I wanted justice. Real, lasting, undeniable justice that would protect my husband's reputation, restore the family business to honest hands, and finally, after 11 years, force this family to see me clearly for who I actually was. The first step was legal. Divya's husband connected us with a lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud within family-owned businesses, a common enough problem. It turned out that an entire area of legal practice existed around it. We met with her secretly, twice a week, over the following month, going over every document, every transaction, every piece of the forensic report line by line, making sure our case was airtight before we made a single move. The lawyer explained something to us that shaped the rest of our strategy. If we went to the police immediately or filed a criminal complaint before informing the rest of the family, it would likely trigger a long, messy legal battle that could drag on for years, during which Rajiv could claim victimhood, hide assets, or even attempt to shift blame back onto Arjun using his influence within the company. Instead, she suggested something more strategic. We needed to first present the evidence in front of the family, the people whose trust and respect actually mattered, the people in whose eyes Rajiv had built his entire reputation, and only then move toward formal legal and financial consequences, once the family itself had already turned away from him. This meant we needed the right moment. A moment when the entire family would be gathered together, when Rajiv would have no room to quietly pull people aside and manage the narrative behind closed doors, when the truth would land in front of everyone at once, exactly the way his cruelty toward me had. That moment arrived naturally, almost poetically. The family's biggest yearly event was approaching, the 40th wedding anniversary of Arjun's parents, an event Rajiv himself was organizing with even more extravagance than my husband's birthday party the year before, because he wanted to use the occasion to formally announce his expanded control over the family business, positioning himself as the sole heir to lead the company into its next generation. I remember when we learned this detail, Arjun looked at me and said quietly, "He's going to use our parents' anniversary to consolidate everything, to make sure no one ever questions his authority again." I looked back at him and said, "Then that is exactly where we expose him." Over the following weeks, we prepared carefully. We compiled the forensic report into a clear, simple presentation that anyone in the family, even those with no financial background, could understand at a glance. We made copies of every document, stored securely in multiple places, so that Rajiv could never claim we had fabricated or altered anything. We quietly informed the lawyer that we intended to present this evidence at the anniversary event itself, and she helped us prepare for the legal steps that would follow immediately afterward. We also made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of confronting Rajiv only through documents, we decided to bring one more piece of evidence, a piece that would remove any last doubt in the minds of family members who might still want to give Rajiv the benefit of the doubt. Divya's husband, through his forensic contacts, had managed to obtain bank statements showing the shell company payments landing directly in accounts connected to Priya's cousin, who, when quietly and carefully approached under the guise of an unrelated business inquiry, nervously admitted, in a recorded conversation obtained legally through the lawyer's guidance, that he had simply been helping Rajiv sir with some paperwork, in exchange for a modest monthly payment, with no real understanding, or so he claimed, of the full scale of what he was participating in. With that recording, the shell company documents, and the forensic report all in place, our case was complete. There was no version of events Rajiv could construct that would survive what we now had in our hands. During this final stretch of preparation, something else happened that I had not fully anticipated. My own quiet business, the freelance consultancy I had built almost as an act of personal healing, had grown large enough that Divya suggested we formally register it as a partnership. We did. I became, officially, co-owner of a small but respected financial consultancy serving several growing businesses in the city. I remember signing those registration papers and feeling something I had not felt in over a decade. Genuine, unshakable pride in something I had built entirely on my own merit, with no family name, no inherited wealth, and no one's permission. Divya hugged me tightly that afternoon and said, half joking, half serious, "You realize you did all this while also planning to take down a corporate fraud, right? Most people can barely manage one of those things." I laughed with her, but privately, I understood something important in that moment. Both efforts had come from the exact same place inside me, a refusal to let other people's low expectations define the limits of what I was capable of building. I remember one particular meeting with our lawyer that I think about often, because of something she said that stayed with me long after the entire ordeal was over. We were going through the recorded conversation with Priya's cousin for what felt like the 10th time, making sure every word, every admission, was clear and legally sound, when she looked up at me and asked a question that had nothing to do with the case itself. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you just leave the marriage instead of doing all of this? It would have been simpler." I thought about that question carefully before answering, because I had asked it of myself many times during those long nights of preparation. This was never only about protecting my marriage, I told her. It was about a family business that supports dozens of employees, about a company my father-in-law spent 40 years building honestly, about children in this family, including my own, who deserve to inherit something real instead of something built on theft. Leaving would have protected me. It would not have protected any of that. She nodded slowly and said something I still remember clearly. Most people, when they're hurt this badly, only think about escape or revenge. You're thinking about repair. That's rarer than you might realize. I did not fully understand the weight of that comment at the time. Looking back now, I think she was right. Somewhere between that humiliating birthday dinner and the anniversary event we were now preparing for, my goal had quietly shifted from simply wanting Rajiv to suffer the way I had suffered, to wanting something more lasting, a family and a business restored to honesty, even if that meant the process itself brought no small amount of pain along the way. Alongside the legal preparation, we made one more quiet decision that I believe made all the difference in how that final night unfolded. Rather than exposing everything as a complete surprise to the entire family at once, we chose to privately inform two people beforehand. Arjun's father, despite his fragile health, and Suresh, the long-serving employee who had worked for the company since its earliest days and whose integrity neither of us ever doubted. We did this not to seek permission, but out of respect for two men who deserved to hear difficult news privately rather than in front of a crowded hall. I remember sitting with Arjun's father in his study, watching his face as he read through the forensic summary we had prepared. He was quiet for a long time, his hands trembling slightly, whether from his illness or from the shock of what he was reading, I could not say for certain. Finally, he looked up at me and said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "I always wondered why you never complained, all these years, about how this family treated you. I assumed you simply accepted it. I did not realize you were paying attention the entire time, more closely than any of us." He reached out and took my hand, and in that single gesture, I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled since the day I married into this family. A quiet, long overdue acknowledgement that I had been seen, finally, for who I actually was. We also spent considerable time during this period preparing for the emotional aftermath, not just the legal one. The lawyer warned us that exposing fraud within a family, no matter how justified, often creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the person directly responsible. Elderly parents can be devastated by the betrayal of a child they trusted completely. Marriages connected to the accused, like Priya's, often do not survive the fallout. Employees can lose their jobs if the business structure needs to be significantly reorganized. We were not simply planning to expose one man's greed. We were preparing to reshape an entire family's future, and we owed it to everyone involved to do so as carefully and as responsibly as possible, even while pursuing justice without compromise. The night before the anniversary event, I sat with Arjun, going over our plan one final time. He reached over and took my hand. "Are you scared?" he asked. I thought about the question honestly before answering. "No," I said. I spent 11 years being scared of what this family thought of me. I'm done being scared of them. Tomorrow, they're finally going to see who I really am. There was a particular family lunch, about a month before Divya's husband finally called with his findings, that tested my resolve more than almost anything else during this entire ordeal. Arjun's mother, still worried and confused about the situation, gently asked me directly, in front of Priya and two visiting aunts, whether I truly believed Arjun was innocent, or whether, as a loyal wife, I simply wanted to believe it. I remember the weight of that question, how it managed to be both sympathetic and quietly accusatory at the same time, suggesting that perhaps my judgment could not be trusted because of my closeness to Arjun, the same way my judgment had never been trusted about anything else in this family. I looked at her calmly and said only, I believe in evidence, not loyalty. And I would ask everyone here to wait for the evidence before deciding anything. Priya gave me a strange look that day, somewhere between suspicion and unease, as if some part of her already sensed that the ground beneath her own family was less solid than she wanted to believe. I did not know, at that lunch, that the trail Divya's husband was following would eventually lead back to her own cousin. I only knew that something in her expression that day told me she, too, was beginning to sense the cracks forming, even if she could not yet name them. During those final weeks of waiting, I found myself returning again and again to a simple mental exercise to keep my fear in check. I would imagine two possible futures. In one, we said nothing. We let the family's whispers harden into accepted truth, and Arjun's name was quietly ruined while Rajiv continued exactly as before, perhaps even using the scandal to further consolidate his control by positioning himself as the responsible brother who had cleaned up his siblings' mess. In the other future, we gathered undeniable proof, and the truth came out so clearly that no amount of charm or manipulation could bury it again. Every time fear crept in during those weeks, and it did, often, in the quiet hours before dawn when I could not sleep, I forced myself to sit with that second future until it felt as real and as possible as the first. I had spent 11 years imagining the worst version of every situation, bracing myself for disappointment before it even arrived. This time, I made myself do the opposite. I made myself imagine winning, in detail, again and again, until the fear no longer felt larger than the plan. What none of us knew yet, not even Rajiv himself, was that the anniversary event he had planned to use as his coronation was about to become the very stage on which his entire empire of lies would collapse, publicly, completely, and permanently. Just as he had once used a microphone to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved, I was about to pick up that same kind of moment and use it to finally tell the truth. The anniversary hall was even grander than the one Rajiv had rented for Arjun's birthday the year before. Gold and white decorations lined the walls. Nearly 300 guests filled the room, relatives, family friends, business partners, and several senior employees of the company Rajiv was preparing to formally claim as his own. My mother-in-law sat at the center of the head table, glowing with happiness, unaware of what the evening was about to reveal. I wore a deep red sari that night, not out of any dramatic symbolism I had planned in advance, but simply because it was the one that made me feel most like myself. Looking back now, I think there was something fitting about it. Red has always meant many things: celebration, warning, courage. That night, it meant all three. Rajiv took the stage exactly as we had anticipated, midway through the event, microphone in hand, ready to deliver what he had clearly rehearsed as a grand speech about family legacy, hard work, and his vision for the company's future. He spoke about his father's original dream, about honoring that dream by expanding it, about how proud he was to now formally take on full leadership of the business for the good of the entire family. He even, at one point, glanced toward me with the faintest trace of his familiar smile, the one that had humiliated me a year earlier, and said, "Of course, we've had a difficult year, with some unfortunate financial mismanagement on certain fronts, but I'm glad to say the company is in safe hands now." That was the moment Arjun stood up. I want to describe this carefully, because it was the moment my husband finally became the man I had always believed he could be. He walked calmly to the front of the room, and without raising his voice, without any anger in his tone, he asked Rajiv a simple question in front of everyone. Before you continue, Can you explain to everyone here what Highline Consulting Services actually does? The room did not go completely silent immediately, the way it does in movies. There was a beat of confused murmuring, a few people glancing at each other, unsure why this question mattered. But Rajiv's face changed. Just slightly. Just enough for those closest to him to notice something shift behind his eyes. That's a business matter, Rajiv said, still smiling, though his voice had tightened. This isn't the place for it. I think it is, Arjun said quietly. Since you were about to blame me, in front of everyone, for financial mismanagement that I had nothing to do with. I stood up then, and I walked to the front of the room alongside my husband. I remember feeling every eye in that hall turn toward me, remembering, I am sure, the last time I had stood near a microphone at a family event, sitting silently while Rajiv humiliated me. This time was different. This time, I was not sitting silently. We had prepared printed summaries of the forensic report, simple enough for anyone to understand, and Divya's husband, present that night as our witness and expert, helped distribute them quietly to key family members, Rajiv's parents, a few trusted senior relatives, and two of the company's longest-serving senior employees who had always struck me as fundamentally honest people, caught for years in the middle of family politics they wanted no part of. I spoke calmly, the way I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times over the past weeks. For the past year, I said, my husband has been blamed for missing funds within this company. I want everyone here tonight to see the truth about where that money actually went. I explained, simply and clearly, the shell companies, the payments, the connection to Priya's cousin, the recorded confession, the forensic trail that led directly back to accounts Rajiv controlled. Rajiv tried, at first, to laugh it off, the same way he had always deflected uncomfortable moments with charm. This is absurd, he said. She's clearly fabricated all of this to protect her husband. Everyone knows she's never understood how this business actually works. It was the same insult he had always used against me. The same dismissal, the same assumption that I was too insignificant, too uneducated in business matters, to ever pose a real threat to him. But this time, the evidence in everyone's hands told a different story than his words did. His own mother was the one who broke the silence. She looked up from the printed report in her trembling hands, tears in her eyes, and said something I will never forget. Rajiv, this has your signature on the approval documents. Explain this to me. Now, for the first time in his life, in front of the entire family and half his company's senior staff, Rajiv had no smooth answer, no charming deflection, no microphone trick to turn the room's attention away from himself and onto someone else's perceived inadequacy. He stood there, silent, exposed, while 300 people who had once respected and feared him began to see him clearly for the first time. The rest of that evening did not unfold in dramatic shouting or chaos, the way you might expect. It unfolded in something quieter and, in many ways, far more devastating for Rajiv. Guests began quietly leaving. Senior employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, already calculating what this meant for their own positions within the company. Priya sat frozen, realizing that her own cousin's involvement meant questions would eventually turn toward her as well. And Rajiv's parents, the two people whose approval he had spent his entire life chasing, looked at him not with anger, but with a grief that seemed to age them both by 10 years in a matter of minutes. I did not gloat that night. I want to be honest about that. I had imagined this moment for months, had pictured myself feeling triumphant, vindicated, perhaps even a little cruel in return for everything Rajiv had put me through. But standing there, watching a family slowly realize how deeply they had been deceived by someone they trusted completely, I did not feel triumphant. I felt something closer to relief. The relief of finally putting down a weight I had carried silently for 11 years. I want to describe one more detail from that night, because it has stayed with me more vividly than almost anything else. As the printed reports moved through the crowd, hand to hand, I watched the exact moment realization cross the faces of people who had known Rajiv for decades, old family friends, long-serving employees, distant relatives who had always spoken of him with a certain reverence. It was not sudden. It moved through the room in waves, like a current passing quietly from table to table, faces shifting from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet, heavy disappointment. One of the company's oldest employees, a man named Suresh who had worked for Arjun's father since the business was barely more than a small office with 3 desks, approached the front of the room at one point, holding the printed report in his shaking hands. He looked directly at Rajiv and said, in a voice thick with emotion, "I trained you. I taught you how this business runs, when you were younger than your own son is now. How could you do this to the people who built this with your father?" Rajiv had no answer for him either. I remember that moment specifically, because it was not my anger or Arjun's that seemed to affect Rajiv most visibly. It was the quiet grief of a man who had watched him grow up, now looking at him as a stranger. Priya, for her part, sat frozen through most of the confrontation, her hands pressed flat against the table in front of her, her face pale. When her cousin's name was mentioned specifically, I saw her flinch, a small, involuntary movement that told me, even before any formal investigation confirmed it, that she had not been fully aware of the depth of what her husband had done, though perhaps she had long suspected something was not right. At one point during the confrontation, Rajiv turned to Arjun directly, his composure finally cracking in a way I had never seen in 11 years of knowing him. "You're really going to do this to me? Your own brother? In front of everyone?" His voice carried a wounded quality, an attempt, even in that moment, to shift the emotional weight of the room back onto Arjun, to make the exposure of his own crimes somehow about his brother's betrayal rather than his own. Arjun did not raise his voice in response. He simply said, quietly enough that the room had to lean in slightly to hear him, "You did this to yourself, years ago, the day you decided your own comfort mattered more than honesty with the people who trusted you. I'm just the one finally saying it out loud." I watched something in Rajiv's face give way completely at those words, some final thread of the confident persona he had maintained for decades finally snapping in front of the very audience he had always performed for. The hall grew quieter after that, not with the shocked murmuring of before, but with a heavier, more exhausted silence, the kind that settles over a room once a difficult truth has finally been spoken and there is nothing left to do but sit with its weight. Waiters continued moving quietly along the edges of the room, unsure whether to continue serving food as if the evening might somehow resume its planned course. It did not. Within the hour, most of the guests had quietly gathered their things and left, offering awkward, half-finished condolences to Arjun's parents on their way out, uncertain how to mark the end of an anniversary celebration that had turned into something else entirely. In the days that followed, the family, led by Arjun's father despite his declining health, made the decision to formally involve the police and the company's legal team. Rajiv was removed from his position as head of the business within the week. The forensic evidence, combined with the recorded confession from Priya's cousin, made any legal defense on his part almost impossible to sustain. He faced serious financial and legal consequences, including repayment demands and formal fraud charges that would take years to resolve through the courts. But for our family, the real transformation happened in the quieter moments that followed, moments I will tell you about now, because they mattered just as much as the dramatic confrontation itself. In the months after that anniversary night, our family did not simply return to normal. There was no version of normal left to return to, and honestly, I did not want one. The normal we had lived under for 11 years was built on my silence and Rajiv's control. That version of our family was gone, and something new, something more honest, slowly began to take its place. Arjun's parents, devastated by what their older son had done, leaned heavily on Arjun to help stabilize the business during the difficult transition that followed. For the first time in his life, my husband stepped fully into a leadership role, not because his brother had granted him permission, but because the family finally recognized his competence and integrity on its own merit. And for the first time in our marriage, he leaned on me too, openly, as an equal partner, asking for my input on financial decisions instead of dismissing my knowledge the way he once had. I want to tell you something that surprised even me during this period. I did not abandon the consultancy business I had built during those quiet months of investigation and preparation. If anything, I grew it further. Divya and I brought on 2 more clients within that first year alone, and eventually, at Arjun's request, I began formally advising the family business itself on financial transparency practices, helping implement the very safeguards that could have caught Rajiv's fraud years earlier if they had existed from the start. The woman who once sat silently at a birthday dinner, absorbing humiliation because she believed she had nothing of value to offer, was now the person the entire family business relied on to keep its finances honest. I do not say this to boast. I say this because I think it matters for anyone listening to this story who has ever been made to feel small by someone who claimed to know their worth better than they did. Sometimes, the very things people use to dismiss you, your background, your quiet nature, your patience, are the exact qualities that eventually become your greatest strength. Priya's involvement, once fully investigated, turned out to be more limited than initially feared. She had not orchestrated the fraud, though she had suspected, on some level, that her cousin's sudden financial improvement was connected to something not entirely honest. She and Rajiv's marriage did not survive the aftermath. Whether that was due to the scandal itself, or simply the slow unraveling of a relationship that had perhaps always been built on convenience rather than genuine partnership, I cannot say for certain. It is not my place to judge that part of their story. The business itself took nearly 2 years to fully stabilize. Under Arjun's leadership, with Suresh promoted into a senior advisory role as a reward for his decades of loyalty, the company implemented new financial controls, including regular independent audits and a clearer separation between family involvement and operational decision-making. Several employees who had quietly worried about the company's direction under Rajiv's leadership later told me, in private conversations, how relieved they felt once transparency became the standard rather than the exception. Suresh, in particular, would often stop by our home on weekends, not for business reasons, simply to share a cup of tea and talk about how the company felt, in his words, like it finally belongs to everyone who built it again, not just to whoever shouts the loudest. Arjun's mother took the longest to heal. For months after that anniversary night, she rarely mentioned Rajiv's name at all, and when she did, her voice carried a grief that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with mourning the version of her son she had believed existed for over 40 years. I made a point, during this period, of visiting her often, not to discuss the scandal, but simply to sit with her, to bring her the specific ginger tea she liked, to let her know that whatever had happened with her older son, she still had a daughter-in-law who genuinely cared for her well-being. Slowly, over many months, something between us that had never quite existed before began to take shape. Not the polite tolerance of our early years together, but something closer to real affection, real trust, built finally on honesty instead of performance. As for Rajiv, I want to share something with you that might surprise you, given everything he put me through. I did not celebrate his downfall the way I once imagined I would. When I saw him, months later, at a smaller family gathering, quieter now, stripped of the confidence that had once filled every room he entered, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever completely, but a kind of sad clarity about how a person's cruelty often grows from their own insecurities, their own desperate need to feel superior to someone, anyone, in order to mask whatever emptiness lives inside them. He never apologized to me directly, not in the way I once dreamed he might. But he did, in a brief and awkward conversation at that gathering, acknowledge something quietly. "You were always smarter than I gave you credit for," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. It was not an apology. But after everything, I understood it was the closest thing to honesty I was ever going to get from him, and I chose to let that be enough, simply so that I could stop carrying the weight of expecting more. My relationship with Arjun healed slowly, not through one dramatic gesture, but through 1,000 small moments of him choosing, finally and consistently, to stand beside me instead of staying silent. We are not the same couple we were before that birthday party humiliated me in front of 200 people. In many ways, we are stronger, because our partnership is now built on something real, mutual respect, earned rather than assumed. I think about that notebook often, the one where I first began quietly documenting suspicious payments, the one that eventually became the foundation of everything that followed. I kept it, even after everything was resolved. It sits in a drawer in my study now, a reminder of a specific truth I want to leave you with tonight. There is a particular kind of power in being underestimated. When people decide you are small, insignificant, incapable of fighting back, they stop watching you closely. They stop guarding their secrets around you, because they do not believe you are paying attention. That inattention, that arrogance, is often the very thing that allows quiet, patient people to eventually uncover truths that louder, more confident people never see coming. If someone in your life has ever humiliated you in front of others, has ever made you feel small in order to make themselves feel powerful, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need to shout to win. You do not need to become cruel yourself to achieve justice. Sometimes, the most powerful response to humiliation is simply this: to quietly, patiently, relentlessly become someone whose worth can no longer be questioned by anyone, least of all the person who once tried to convince you that you had none. I think often about my daughter, the one who asked me that painful question at Arjun's birthday dinner all those months ago. Why is everyone laughing at you, Mama? A little over a year after the anniversary event, she asked me something different. We were sitting together at the dining table, where I still did most of my consultancy work in the quiet hours after school, and she watched me for a while before asking, "Mama, are you a boss now?" I laughed and told her I was something like that, yes. She thought about this for a moment and then said, with the simple confidence only a child can have, "Good. I want to be a boss too, like you." I did not tell her the whole story that day. She was still too young for most of it. But I remember thinking, in that quiet, ordinary moment at our kitchen table, that this was the real ending I had been fighting for all along. Not Rajiv's downfall, though that mattered too, in its own necessary way. Not even the restoration of the family business, though that mattered deeply as well. The real victory was smaller, quieter, and far more permanent than any single confrontation could ever be. It was my daughter growing up watching her mother build something real, instead of growing up watching her mother shrink herself to fit inside someone else's cruelty. I also think, sometimes, about the version of myself who sat silently at that birthday dinner, absorbing humiliation because she believed silence was the price of belonging. I do not look back at her with embarrassment. I look back at her with a kind of tenderness, the way you might look at someone you once were and no longer need to be. She was not weak. She was simply waiting for the right moment, gathering strength she did not yet know she had, preparing herself, without even realizing it, for the fight that was still to come. I also want to share something about my own consultancy, because I think the ending of that particular thread matters just as much as the ending of the family drama. 3 years after that anniversary night, Divya and I opened a small office of our own, no longer working solely from dining tables and borrowed hours between school pickups. We now employ 4 other people, several of them women who, like me, had spent years being underestimated in one way or another before finding a place where their actual abilities were finally allowed to matter. I think of that office often as a kind of quiet monument, not to revenge, but to everything that becomes possible once a person stops waiting for permission to be taken seriously. I still remember, vividly, sitting in the family business office for the first time in an official advisory capacity, going through financial records with the same careful attention I once used late at night in my kitchen, except now, no one in the room dismissed my presence or questioned why I was there. Arjun's father, before he passed away peacefully 2 years after the scandal, once told me that watching me work in that office, respected finally by everyone present, was one of the proudest moments of his life. I have carried that memory with me every day since, a quiet counterweight to every dismissive comment that came before it. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is this: dignity delayed is not dignity denied. If you are in a season of your life right now where you feel small, overlooked, humiliated by people who should know better, I want you to understand that this feeling is not permanent, and it is not proof of your actual worth. It is simply a chapter, and chapters end. What you do in the quiet months and years that follow, how you rebuild, how you learn, how patiently you gather your own version of strength, that is the part of the story that determines how it ultimately ends. That night at the anniversary hall, when the truth finally came out in front of everyone, I did not need to raise my voice, throw an insult, or humiliate Rajiv the way he had humiliated me. The truth did all of that work on its own. All I had to do was have the patience to uncover it, and the courage to finally speak it out loud. They laughed at me once, in front of everyone I loved. In the end, I did not need to make them stop laughing at me. I simply gave them a much better reason to never laugh at me again. And that, in the end, is the last laugh that truly matters. Not loud, not cruel, but quiet, earned, and permanent.